What would you do if your children could hear perfectly, but chose silence because the world had hurt them too much? If this story touches your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Echoes of Stories. We love hearing from you, so tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The accident happened on a Tuesday. That's what James Anderson remembered most clearly. Not the screaming sirens or the twisted metal or even the moment the doctor told him his wife didn't make it. He remembered it was Tuesday because his sons had eaten pancakes that morning, and Rebecca had laughed when maple syrup got stuck in Mason's hair. By Wednesday, everything had changed. The car had flipped 3 times on the highway. Rebecca died on impact. The 4 boys survived with barely a scratch on their bodies. But something inside them had broken in a way no bandage could fix. When James finally brought them home from the hospital, he discovered a silence so thick it felt like walking through water. Mason was 6 years old. His twin brother Liam was 6 too. Aiden had just turned 5, and little Tyler was 4. Before the crash, their house had been full of noise. The boys would chase each other through the hallways, shouting and giggling. They would sing made-up songs about dinosaurs and rocket ships. Tyler's favorite thing was to yell, "Daddy's home," so loud the neighbors could hear. Now, nothing. James would clap his hands behind their heads. No reaction. He would drop pots and pans in the kitchen. They didn't even blink. He would call their names, sometimes softly, sometimes desperately shouting until his throat hurt. The boys just stared at him with empty eyes. The doctors ran every test imaginable. They put the boys in huge machines that took pictures of their brains. They checked their ears with tiny cameras and bright lights. They measured brain waves and nerve signals. Every single test came back the same way. Perfectly normal. Their ears work fine, Dr. Martinez explained, showing James charts he couldn't understand. Their brains can process sound. But something happened during the trauma. They've shut down. We call it psychogenic deafness. Their minds have decided that hearing is too dangerous. James didn't understand. How could a mind just decide to stop hearing? Think of it like this, the doctor said gently. The last sounds they heard were terrible. The crash. The screaming. Their mother. Their brains are protecting them by turning off the volume completely. Over the next 2 years, James tried everything. He took the boys to audiologists who fitted them with hearing aids they didn't need. He hired neurologists who prescribed medicines that did nothing. He brought in trauma therapists who sat with the boys for hours, trying to unlock whatever door had closed inside them. Nothing worked. The boys learned to communicate through gestures and made-up signs. Mason would tap his stomach when he was hungry. Liam pointed at things he wanted. Aiden would pull people by the hand to show them things. Tyler, the youngest, mostly just held onto his brothers and watched the world with worried eyes. James had to quit his job at the investment firm. His billions meant nothing when he couldn't help his own children. He spent his days watching them play in silence, wondering if he'd ever hear their voices again. Sometimes he would sit in Rebecca's closet, holding her clothes, and cry where the boys couldn't see. The mansion felt like a museum. Beautiful and empty and cold. That's when Grace Okafor arrived. She was 24 years old, with dark skin that glowed in the sunlight and eyes that seemed to notice everything. She wasn't like the other nannies James had hired. Those women had treated the boys like broken things that needed fixing. Grace treated them like they were already whole. On her first day, she didn't try to make them hear. She didn't clap or shout or test them. Instead, she sat on the floor of the playroom and started moving her hands. The boys stopped what they were doing and stared. Grace was using sign language. Real sign language, not the made-up gestures the boys had been using. Her fingers danced through the air, forming words and sentences. She was telling them a story about a turtle who went on an adventure. Mason tilted his head, fascinated. Liam crawled closer. Even Tyler, who usually hid behind his brothers, peeked out to watch. When Grace finished the story, she smiled and signed, "I'm happy to meet you." For the first time in 2 years, James saw something flicker in his son's eyes. Not quite hope, but maybe the beginning of curiosity. Over the next few weeks, Grace taught the boys proper sign language. She was patient and kind, never frustrated when they got confused. She played games with them in the garden, letting them feel grass between their toes and wind against their faces. She painted with them, read to them through signs, and slowly began to pull them out of their shells. But she noticed something the doctors hadn't. One afternoon, James found Grace sitting in the garden, watching the boys play near the fountain. She had a strange look on her face, like she'd just solved a puzzle. "Mr. Anderson," she said quietly, "I need to show you something." She stood up and walked to where the boys were playing. They were stacking rocks, completely focused on their game. Grace picked up the garden hose and turned it on, creating a spray of water that caught the sunlight like diamonds. The spray made a rhythmic sound as it hit the fountain's surface. Splash, 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 splash. Tyler's head jerked up. His eyes went wide. He dropped his rock and stared at the water. Then something incredible happened. His whole body started moving in time with the splashing. Not dancing exactly, but swaying. Feeling something. Grace turned off the water. Tyler stopped moving, looking confused and a little scared. She turned it back on. Tyler's body responded again, rocking gently with the rhythm. James felt his heart start to pound. What does this mean? Grace's eyes were bright with excitement. "Mr. Anderson, I don't think your sons are completely deaf. I think they're feeling sound instead of hearing it." "That's impossible." "Is it?" Grace turned the hose spray toward the other boys. One by one, they reacted. Aiden's shoulders moved. Mason's hands stopped mid-air. Liam turned his whole body toward the sensation. "Sound is vibration," Grace explained. "When sound waves hit us, we don't just hear them with our ears. We feel them through our skin, our bones, our whole bodies. I think your sons have learned to sense sound in a different way." James stared at his children, hardly daring to hope. "Can we use this? Can we bring them back?" Grace smiled, and it was the first time in 2 years that James felt something warm bloom in his chest. "I think we can try." That night, James couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Tyler swaying to the rhythm of the water, about the way all 4 boys had responded to something they supposedly couldn't hear. He found himself standing in the garden at 3 in the morning, staring at the fountain, trying to understand what Grace had discovered. The next morning, Grace arrived with a notebook full of ideas and a determination that reminded James of Rebecca. She had stayed up all night researching something called vibrational therapy. "Most people think hearing only happens in the ears," she explained, spreading papers across the kitchen table. "But that's not true. Deaf musicians can feel music through vibrations. They sense the bass through the floor, the drums through their chests. Some of them become amazing dancers because they experience rhythm through their entire bodies." James picked up one of the articles. The words were complicated, but the idea was simple. Sound made things vibrate. If the boys could feel those vibrations, maybe they could learn to connect them to meaning again. "So what do we do?" he asked. Grace's eyes sparkled. "We turn the garden into a place where sound becomes something they can touch." They started small. Grace brought in a large plastic container and filled it with water. She placed it in the center of the garden where the boys played every day. Then she brought out her phone and played music, holding it against the side of the container. The water rippled and danced. Little waves formed patterns on the surface, each one moving to the beat of the song. Mason was the first to notice. He walked over and stared at the water, confused. Grace took his hand and gently pressed it against the outside of the container. His eyes went huge. He could feel it. The music was making the container vibrate, and the vibrations traveled through his palm. Grace signed to him, "This is music. Can you feel it dancing?" Mason nodded slowly, then pressed both hands against the container. His mouth opened in silent wonder. Within minutes, all 4 boys were gathered around, touching the container, feeling the music move through the water and into their hands. For the first time since the accident, they looked truly alive. But Grace didn't stop there. She had bigger plans. Over the next week, she transformed the garden into what she called the feeling place. She hung wind chimes made of different materials all around. Metal ones that created high vibrations. Wooden ones that made deeper, slower movements. She placed drums of different sizes on the grass and showed the boys how hitting them made waves of feeling travel through the ground. She brought in a portable speaker, the kind that created powerful bass sounds, and let the boys sit near it. When deep music played, they could feel it in their chests, like a second heartbeat. James watched it all with growing amazement and something he'd almost forgotten how to feel: hope. One afternoon, Grace did something unexpected. She started singing. Her voice was beautiful, rich and warm like honey. She sang an old lullaby, something soft and gentle. But here's what made it special. While she sang, she held Tyler in her lap and placed his small hand against her throat. Tyler's eyes widened. He could feel her voice box vibrating against his palm. Each word created a different pattern, a different sensation. Grace kept singing, and Tyler kept his hand pressed to her throat, completely mesmerized. When she finished, Tyler did something that made James's heart nearly stop. The little boy opened his mouth and made a sound. Not a word, just a small noise, rough and uncertain. But it was the first sound he'd made in 2 years. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She signed to Tyler, "You have a voice too. It lives in here." She touched his throat gently. Tyler touched his own throat, feeling confused. Grace took his hand and placed it there, then encouraged him to try again. This time, when Tyler made a sound, he felt the vibration in his own throat. His eyes grew round with understanding. "That's it, baby," Grace whispered, even though he couldn't hear her words. "You're remembering." James had to leave the garden. He walked into the house and sat on the kitchen floor, sobbing like he hadn't since Rebecca's funeral. But these weren't tears of sadness. These were tears of possibility. Grace's next idea was the most radical yet. She'd been researching bone conduction technology. Regular headphones sent sound through the air into your ears. But bone conduction headphones sent vibrations directly through the bones of your skull into your inner ear, bypassing your eardrums completely. "If their brains shut down the normal hearing pathway," Grace explained, "maybe we can sneak sound in through a different door." James ordered the most expensive bone conduction headphones he could find. When they arrived, Grace fitted them carefully on Mason's head. They sat behind his ears, not inside them, pressing gently against the bones. She played a simple song. Just a piano playing one note at a time. Mason's whole body went rigid. His hands flew up to the headphones, but not to take them off. To press them closer. His mouth opened and closed. He looked at Grace with absolute shock, then his face crumpled and he started crying. Grace pulled him into her arms, rocking him. She signed, "It's okay. It's just sound. You're safe. I promise you're safe." But Mason wasn't crying from fear. James realized that with a jolt. His son was crying because he was hearing something. Really, truly hearing. And it was overwhelming and beautiful and terrifying all at once. They tried the headphones on Liam next. He had a similar reaction, though he didn't cry. Instead, he started laughing, a silent laugh that shook his whole body. He touched the headphones, touched his head, touched Grace's face, trying to understand where the sensation was coming from. Aiden was cautious. He let Grace put the headphones on but kept his eyes squeezed shut, like he was afraid of what he might experience. Grace played soft nature sounds. Rain falling. Birds singing. Wind through trees. Slowly, Aiden's face relaxed. He opened his eyes and looked at Grace with something like wonder. He signed, "What is this?" Grace signed back, "The world. This is what the world sounds like." Tyler was the youngest and the most scared. He refused to wear the headphones at first, hiding behind Mason and shaking his head. But when he saw his brother's reactions, curiosity won over fear. Grace put the headphones on him and played the same lullaby she'd sung days before. The one he'd felt through her throat. Tyler's face transformed. He recognized it. Not just as vibrations now, but as something more. Something his brain was starting to remember how to process as sound. He pointed at Grace and then at the headphones, signing frantically, "You. This is you." Grace nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, baby. That's my song. You're hearing my song." That night, James sat with all 4 boys in their bedroom. They were exhausted from the day's discoveries, curled up together in a pile like puppies. Grace had given him the headphones and a playlist she'd made. Simple songs. Clear sounds. Nothing harsh or scary. He played them softly while the boys drifted off to sleep. And for the first time in 2 years, James let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, his sons would find their way back to the world of sound. Not the terrifying sound of the accident, but the gentle sound of wind chimes and lullabies and a father's voice saying, "I love you." Tyler shifted in his sleep and smiled. Just a little. But it was enough. The breakthrough didn't happen all at once. Grace warned James about that from the beginning. Healing was like planting a garden. You couldn't force flowers to bloom. You could only give them sunlight and water and patience, and trust that growth would come in its own time. But now that they'd found the path, Grace walked it with determination. She turned the entire east wing of the mansion into what she called the vibration room. The floors were special platforms that could pulse with bass frequencies. When music played, the whole room hummed with it. The boys could lie on the floor and feel songs travel through their entire bodies. Grace brought in instruments. Drums that the boys could hit and feel shake their arms. A large gong that created waves so powerful they could feel it in their teeth. She found a special piano where they could touch the wood while she played and sense each note resonating through the frame. Every day became a new experiment in sensation. Mason loved the drums best. He would hit them for hours, feeling the vibrations travel up his arms and into his chest. Grace noticed that he started hitting them in patterns, creating rhythms. One day, she realized he was copying a song he'd heard through the bone conduction headphones. He was remembering. His brain was making connections between the feeling and the meaning. Liam was drawn to the wind chimes. He would stand in the garden for long stretches, touching different chimes and feeling how each material created different sensations. Metal was sharp and quick. Wood was deep and slow. Bamboo was somewhere in between. Grace watched him organize the chimes by feeling, creating his own system for understanding sound. Aiden surprised everyone by becoming obsessed with Grace's voice. He would sit with her for hours, his small hand pressed against her throat or chest while she talked, sang, and read stories. He was mapping language, figuring out how words felt different from each other. How questions had a different vibration than statements. How happiness made her voice bounce and sadness made it heavy. And Tyler, the youngest, became the bravest. Once he got used to the bone conduction headphones, he didn't want to take them off. He wore them from morning until bedtime, soaking in every sound he could. Grace played him everything: music, audiobooks, recordings of nature, even simple conversations. Tyler's brain was rewiring itself, remembering how to process sound not as danger but as information, as beauty, as connection. 3 months after Grace's discovery in the garden, something remarkable happened. James was in his office, trying to focus on emails he'd been ignoring. Grace had taken the boys to the garden for their afternoon session. He could see them through the window, playing with the water container and the various instruments Grace had scattered around. Then he heard it. A voice. Thin and uncertain and rough from years of not being used, but definitely a voice. More. James dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the floor, but he didn't notice. He ran to the window. Tyler was standing by the garden hose, looking at Grace. His mouth was moving. He was speaking. "More spray," Tyler said, the words clumsy but clear. "Please." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. She grabbed the hose with shaking hands and turned it on, creating the spray pattern that had started everything. Tyler laughed, and the sound of it, the actual sound, made James's knees weak. He ran outside, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. "Tyler!" he called. "Tyler, can you hear me?" Tyler turned, his face scrunched up with concentration. "Daddy," he said, uncertain. "Is that Daddy's voice?" James fell to his knees and pulled his youngest son into his arms, sobbing. "Yes, baby. Yes, it's Daddy." You can hear me. You can hear me. Tyler pulled back and looked at his father's face with wonder. You sound different than you feel, he said seriously. When I touch your throat, you feel low. But your voice sounds higher. Grace laughed through her tears. That's because feeling sound and hearing sound are different, sweetie. You're learning both now. You're experiencing sound in two ways. Over the next weeks, the other boys followed. Aiden was next, whispering words to Grace when they were alone in the vibration room. Then Mason, shouting triumphantly when he finally heard his own drum beats with his ears instead of just his hands. Liam took the longest, but one morning he woke up and said, I hear birds, in a voice filled with absolute wonder. But hearing wasn't perfect or complete. The boys heard some frequencies better than others. High sounds were still difficult. Loud noises could frighten them, bringing back flashes of the accident. They needed the bone conduction headphones for complex sounds like conversation. Sometimes they preferred to sign because it felt safer. Grace never pushed. Healing isn't about being fixed, she told James. It's about finding new ways to be whole. She continued the therapy. The boys still spent hours in the vibration room, still touched instruments and water containers and Grace's throat when she sang. They were building a relationship with sound that was richer than most people ever experienced. They didn't just hear the world. They felt it, sensed it, lived inside it. James hired specialists who understood vibrational therapy. They brought new tools, new techniques. But Grace remained the heart of it all. She'd stopped being just a nanny months ago. She was family now. The boys called her Gracie, and Tyler refused to sleep unless she sang him her lullaby first. One evening, 6 months after that first discovery in the garden, James found all 4 boys and Grace sitting in a circle on the grass. It had rained that afternoon, and everything smelled fresh and clean. Birds were singing in the trees. The fountain bubbled softly. Wind chimes rang in the breeze. The boys weren't using headphones. They were just sitting there, listening. Really listening. Do you hear that? Mason said, his voice getting stronger every day. The birds, Liam answered. They sound like the wooden chimes. I like the fountain best, Aiden said. It sounds like it's telling a story. Tyler had his eyes closed, a peaceful smile on his face. I hear everything, he whispered. The whole world is singing. Grace caught James's eye and smiled. He mouthed the words, thank you, but they weren't enough. Nothing would ever be enough to express what she'd given back to him. That night, after the boys were asleep, James stood in Rebecca's closet again. But this time he wasn't crying. He was talking to her, telling her about their sons, about how they were healing, about how life was finding its way back into their home. They're going to be okay, he whispered to the darkness. They're different now. They experience the world in ways most people never will. But they're going to be okay. And somewhere in the garden, wind chimes rang out in agreement. The story of 4 boys who lost their hearing to trauma and found it again through vibration reminds us that healing rarely looks the way we expect. Sometimes the path back isn't about returning to who we were before. Sometimes it's about discovering who we can become after. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that there's always another way forward, even when the first path seems forever closed. Subscribe to Echoes of Stories for more tales of hope, resilience, and the extraordinary power of the human spirit to adapt, survive, and thrive. Because in the end, healing isn't about silence or sound. It's about connection. And connection can be felt in 1,000 different ways, as long as someone cares enough to help you find them. The boys still visit the garden every day. They still touch the water when it sprays. They still press their hands to Grace's throat when she sings. But now they hear her too. And that makes all the difference.